symbols, historical symbols, or just anything. And a cynic would say it's often when things aren't going well, or when there's a crisis, or when they need some sort of publicity for a particular purpose. I'm thinking about the University of Michigan right now, and two former football players have been camping out on the president's front yard, calling for him to fire I think he's the head athletic trainer. He also has a faculty position, who is the only employee who's still working at Michigan who was employed at the time that a medical doctor was sexually abusing football players for decades. And one of those football players is Black, who's been camping out on the front lawn. And interestingly, Michigan, it's the creation of a new rivalry. Northwestern is not Michigan's rival. If you're like ranking the order of Michigan's rivals, it's not in the top 5. But they have this new rivalry trophy with Northwestern, the George Jewett Trophy, to honor the first Black football player who played at both Michigan and Northwestern. And so a cynic or a skeptic would say, okay, like, what is the why is this being introduced right now? If you're in an athletic department that's just dealing with trying to put out many fires and a very large one, and you're not doing a very good job of it, this could be kind of a PR move to try to bring more positive attention, and then drawing upon history is a very good and convenient way to do that. So maybe the Rose will come back if the Blazers and Man U keep messing up and keep trying to introduce super leagues and that sort of thing.
Yeah, we're certainly in the midst of that right now. They are messing up big time. And I can attest to that.
Well, you need to write something if the Rose comes back and peg it to this use of history.
These symbols are always choices, and this in 1909 is a time when there are a lot of things which are now traditions in Britain that are kind of being created. So I don't know the explanation here, but it may be that Manchester was kind of playing around with options, and this is the option. This is an option they decided not to keep, but it does very much look like that way. And those are choices which, the ridiculous, like the fist on the chest thing. Yeah. There's this repertoire that they can reach into and pull that out, and it would be really interesting if that comes back as a symbol. Because I think what you just said a few minutes ago about your kind of investigation of this, and maybe this is where Manchester City is kind of being a little bit cleverer than Man U. Although I don't know. but is that if you want committed fans to buy your stuff, the deeper they can go, the more interesting history can look, the better, I think. So having those kinds of details and referencing those details might work. I don't know if it would work or it will work, but it could work. But I think, so I really like that you've covered. The question I was going to ask you until I read the final draft and realized that you didn't answer it was about.
There were things I kind of thought I should. Yeah. It just with how it was going. Some of your comments I just kind of thought, well, I can just kind of. Right. Sorry.
But no. I think what I was going to say is that I think this. I have a better sense, a clear sense now of both what is representative about this rivalry and what is distinctive about it, which I think is one of the main things I was curious about this. And the other thing that really struck me as I was reading the final draft last week is the centrality of kind of the physical geography of this to your argument that this rivalry is different, is fundamentally different, or not fundamentally, but maybe it's rather different from other kinds of rivalry, and this is something that is sort of created by the geography, and then the geography maps back onto the Wars of the Roses conflict. So I wanted to ask, and you could touch on this a little bit, in what ways does sort of broader in any ways, there's broader kind of social and economic change in Britain in the 20th century, kind of, in what ways is it reflected by what you're seeing with the rivalry here? And Leeds and Manchester are both post-industrial cities. In both cases, the governments since the 1990s have been trying various different kind of economic development tricks. The EU has gotten involved in at least Leeds and probably Manchester. But what kind of, so you cover a lot of the social and cultural aspects of kind of what it means to be a fan of these teams, what it means for these teams to talk about community. In what ways does this take to kind of wider economic patterns or changes in community?
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm trying to remember. So I remember there was one important document from my research that touched on this, and I will mention to try to deep dive. So it's this idea of, like you mentioned, social and cultural, but also economic envy. The critical word is envy here, because Manchester, as I briefly mentioned, they're a bit more of a present economic pole for Britain, and this is found even beyond the 20th century, because in the I think I'm getting my timelines wrong, but I remember there was one interesting document that I managed to find in the very latter final stages of my research. This important canal that was built between Manchester and Liverpool, and this canal was meant essentially for Manchester merchants to be able to better export their goods without going through Liverpool dues that they would get dinged on while exporting these goods. And so that outraged Liverpool quite a bit. But that's an example of how Manchester was able to start becoming a more industrial, even more economic, prosperous a place in Britain, and more specifically between them and Leeds. During the Industrial Revolution, both cities had a crucial commodity, a textile commodity. With Manchester, I think it was wool, and Leeds it was cotton. And Manchester's wool industry completely blew Leeds's cotton industry out of the water. Oh, I got it wrong. Okay. I was afraid I was going to get it mixed up. Sorry. So Manchester, it's cotton, and Leeds it's wool. Or?
I think so. Okay. I don't actually know about Leeds.
Okay. But I guess what I am trying to say is that specifically they directly competed in the textile industry. Manchester won, and so with that starts to generate this economic envy. And because the book The Club, which was from your class, Dr. Jackson, it did mention in a quote that some cities like Leeds, Stoke, Huddersfield, they're no longer these economic poles for Britain. They just don't have the means to be able to keep up with other cities, especially London and Liverpool and Manchester. And so seeing that they were able to directly compete in an industrial sense, and how Manchester was victorious, that plays into an economic envy, which then continues to blend with social envy, because that same article that mentioned that economic point mentioned how socially just Manchester was a bit more popular. Like, for example, in the musical industry, their stars were more well known than the Leeds stars that they could produce. And so this continued evolution of essentially Big Brother, Little Brother, if you will, and how Manchester in all these different areas were able to outdo Leeds in what they were directly competing in, definitely contributes to this envy. And I would like to cite one of your questions, Dr. Jackson. You mentioned why would this rivalry? Well, who is it more important towards, and why is it probably Leeds? Well, it's the case because of this underdog mentality, because again, they're constantly second fiddle to Manchester and Manchester United, and so being able to have an opportunity to finally outdo them in a specific area, and also bringing back up the idea of how there's a separation with how more deeply rooted the clubs and the people are. Again, to cite one of your questions, if you ask people if they would know about this history, I would say that a person from Leeds in Yorkshire would just be a bit more knowing of what what's going on here, in that, I would know that, Yorkshire and us Yorks and Lancs, we don't like each other, and it's just, we really just want to put them in their place, and I think they would have a bit more knowledge of that compared to someone from Manchester who's just like, well, in Leeds, they're just annoying scrappers. We got to worry about, the Scousers in Liverpool, and so all of that at play here. It's definitely a sense of envy, I would say, to answer your question. I think it's definitely envy, which has a base in not only social but economic as well.
I didn't know about rivalry until you told me about it, so yeah, I think this, not that I'm from Manchester. I think that the use of the term social enterprise is really interesting here, because it's marking out a purpose for these clubs that's, I don't know when that comes in, but it sounds a lot like the language of governments from the 1990s in Britain, talking about various different things as social enterprises as ways of doing economic kind of revitalization in the north, and in exactly the area where most of these clubs are. So that's just a comment that I thought that was really interesting, that language is, and it goes back to Newcastle and what Chris Jackson was saying about the current events that are kind of chasing your thesis. That this is like, these clubs are very weird institutions because they're doing so many different things in so many different places. And I think again, your thesis is interesting because it's kind of dissecting out some of how the geography changes and it gets mixed up in, or even kind of forgotten or pushed to the side in the ways in which these institutions are changing from being social clubs or sort of sporting clubs with a social and economic purpose to being